In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan was a force of nature, sweeping across Asia with devastating speed and fury. Their army, feared for its relentless tactics and brutality, seemed unstoppable. But in the face of this savage juggernaut, an unexpected challenger emerged from the distant lands of the East, the Chinese. Through cunning strategy, psychological warfare, and tactical brilliance, the Chinese turned the tide and inflicted one of the most stunning defeats in military history. But how did a group of people, once considered inferior by the Mongols, manage to bring them to their knees? You're about to discover the secrets behind one of the most overlooked battles of the Middle Ages, where the underestimated, outnumbered, and seemingly weaker force pulled off the unthinkable. The Mongol Empire, under the iron will of Genghis Khan, was a storm that swept across the heart of Asia. There had never been a military force so relentless, so efficient, and so ruthless. Riding upon swift, untiring horses, the Mongols appeared like a horde of wolves descending upon the plains. They didn't simply invade. They conquered and annihilated. The thunder of their hooves echoed in every kingdom they approached, and for those who opposed them, there was no refuge. From the steppes of Mongolia to the far reaches of Eastern Europe, Genghis Khan's empire expanded faster than anyone could comprehend. His warriors were not only skilled in the art of war, but also in terror. The Mongol tactics were a perfect blend of fear and precision. Their famed horse archers, able to rain arrows with devastating accuracy while retreating or advancing, made them almost invincible on the open field. The Mongols' feigned retreats, designed to lure enemy forces into traps, left countless adversaries decimated, their ranks broken in ways unimaginable. But as the Mongol conquests neared the borders of China, things began to change. Unlike the vast open plains of Central Asia and Europe, China presented a different challenge, an empire entrenched in centuries of dynastic rule, a society fortified by its cities and dense landscapes. The Mongols had little experience dealing with such an environment, where high walls, fortified gates, and a deep-seated bureaucracy stood ready to repel them. The Southern Song dynasty in particular was both an opportunity and a threat to the Mongols. The Song had been besieged by the Jin dynasty for years, and when the Mongols swept into China, they found an already fractured land. But the Mongols underestimated their enemy. The Song dynasty, despite its military shortcomings, had a few secrets of its own, secrets that would come to haunt Genghis Khan's descendants. While the Mongols relied on their military might, the Chinese knew that sometimes the greatest victories didn't come from force, but from the mind. The Southern Song might not have had the military power to fight the Mongols head-to-head, but they were no strangers to siege warfare, deception, and the use of nature to their advantage. As the Mongol Empire grew stronger, the Chinese faced a crucial decision: resist or succumb. But history would remember how, in the face of the most terrifying force known to mankind, the Chinese didn't back down, they adapted. Instead of confronting the Mongols in open battle, they would fight with something far more dangerous than swords or bows, their cunning and strategy. The Mongols, blind to the challenges that lay before them, continued their relentless march towards the heart of China, convinced of their inevitable victory. But what they didn't realize was that the Chinese, the very people they had long seen as weak and inferior, were preparing to play a game of war unlike any they had ever known. And in this deadly game of chess, the Chinese would prove that intelligence and patience could overcome even the most brutal of forces. When the Mongols swept into northern China, they encountered not a unified empire, but a fractured land divided by pride, politics, and exhaustion. The Jin dynasty had already fallen under their hooves, its cities reduced to ash and silence. The Southern Song dynasty, proud but weary, now stood as the last bastion of Chinese civilization. For the Mongols, it seemed a mere matter of time before the dragon's head was severed from its body. But within the chaos of collapsing dynasties, a quiet determination began to take root. The Chinese found themselves facing an impossible choice. To surrender meant slavery. To resist meant annihilation. The Mongols had crushed the mighty Khwarezmian Empire, obliterated cities like Zhengdu and Bukhara, and burned entire populations alive to make examples of disobedience. Their reputation preceded them like a shadow of death. Yet, for the Chinese, surrender was not an option. For centuries, their civilization had stood as a beacon of art, science, and philosophy, an empire that considered itself the center of the world. The Mongols might have conquered the land, but the Chinese spirit would not bow so easily. In this atmosphere of despair and defiance emerged a new kind of leadership. Among the remnants of broken armies and terrified citizens, men of intellect began to rise. Scholars turned strategists, engineers turned warlords, monks turned generals. One of them was Zhu Yuanzhang, a man born into poverty, orphaned by plague and tempered by hardship. He had seen the Mongols' brutality firsthand. Yet, beneath his humble appearance, Zhu possessed something that no Mongol general could match: patience and vision. While the Mongols relied on speed and destruction, Zhu studied the art of endurance. He understood that the Mongols thrived in open battle, but struggled with sieges and long campaigns. China's geography, with its rivers, mountains, and dense urban centers, could become both shield and sword. Zhu began gathering loyal followers, uniting fragmented militias and peasant rebels into something greater, a coordinated resistance. His message spread like wildfire. If the enemy cannot be defeated in strength, defeat him in time. In the cities of the Yangtze Delta, engineers rebuilt ancient flood systems. Farmers were secretly trained as saboteurs. The Chinese adapted their walls and fortresses to counter Mongol siege engines, while spies infiltrated Mongol supply lines, spreading false reports and confusion. Every move was deliberate, every delay calculated. The Mongols, accustomed to lightning warfare, found themselves bogged down by mud, disease, and invisible enemies. But the Chinese dilemma was not just military, it was psychological. How do you fight a force that claims divine destiny? How do you stand against warriors who believe that their Khan was chosen by the heavens? Zhu's answer was simple, yet profound. Show them that heaven's favor can change. The Chinese began to turn their struggle into a spiritual crusade. Prophets and poets declared that the mandate of heaven had abandoned the Mongols. The empire of the horsemen would fall not by force, but by fate. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Small Mongol patrols vanished in the southern marshes. Supply caravans failed to arrive. Even among the Mongol ranks, rumors spread, whispers that the Chinese sorcerers had cursed the land, that the rivers themselves rose to defend their people. Superstition, once the Mongols' weapon, began to work against them. The dilemma of the Chinese had become their strength. They could not defeat the Mongols by meeting them in the field, but they could defeat them by turning every inch of China into a trap. And under Zhu Yuanzhang's watchful eye, that transformation had already begun. The era of submission was ending. The era of strategy was about to begin. War had always been the Mongols' element. On open ground, they were gods of the battlefield. Their horses thundered across plains, their arrows blotted out the sun. But China was not a plain. It was a labyrinth of rivers that twisted like serpents, of misty valleys, and of cities whose walls stood like sleeping mountains. And within this maze, the Chinese learned the most valuable lesson of all. To defeat the Mongols, they had to stop fighting like soldiers and start thinking like hunters. The first rule of deception was patience. Zhu Yuanzhang and his generals studied the Mongol army with meticulous precision. They noted their habits, how the Mongols camped, how they moved, how they fed their horses. The Mongols' strength was also their weakness, speed. They moved fast, too fast for their own supply lines to keep up. Their horses devoured the grasslands. Their men drained rivers dry. The Chinese understood that if they couldn't stop the Mongols head-on, they could starve them, not through famine, but through strategy. So began a war of shadows. Chinese scouts, disguised as peasants, roamed ahead of Mongol columns, mapping every hill, every ford, every choke point. Villagers along the Mongols' path abandoned their homes, taking with them all food, all water, even the grain hidden in the rafters. What remained was a barren trail. The Mongols marched through villages that seemed cursed, silent, empty, stripped bare. Their horses, hungry and restless, grew thin. Their commanders grew impatient. Then the traps began. Small Chinese detachments appeared on the horizon, too small to pose a threat, just enough to provoke pursuit. The Mongols gave chase, confident in their speed. But as they thundered through the hills, their horses stumbled into pits covered with reeds, or their archers found themselves ambushed from cliffs above. The Chinese did not stay to fight. They vanished like smoke. Every Mongol victory became a wound. The most brilliant deception came near the banks of the Yangtze. Zhu Yuanzhang's strategists spread rumors that a Song garrison, heavily fortified but poorly led, held vast stores of grain. Mongol scouts confirmed it. They saw fires, soldiers on the walls, and wagons moving through the gates. Tempted by the promise of plunder, the Mongols struck at dawn. But when their siege engines rolled into place and their cavalry surrounded the fortress, something felt wrong. The walls were too quiet. The banners did not flutter in the wind. Then the fires on the towers flickered and died. The fortress was an illusion, built of bamboo and canvas, manned by wooden effigies. When the Mongols realized the trick, it was too late. Hidden Chinese artillery unleashed a rain of fire from across the river. Arrows of flame struck their siege engines. Their camps exploded into chaos. The Mongols withdrew, furious and humiliated. For the first time, they faced an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. It was not strength that beat them. It was cunning. The Chinese learned to weaponize nature itself. They released floods from the dams of the Huai River, turning Mongol encampments into swamps. They built false bridges that collapsed under the weight of cavalry. They lured Mongol patrols into forests thick with traps, snares, pits, even sharpened bamboo stakes hidden beneath leaves. Every tree, every river, every gust of wind became part of China's invisible army. The Mongols began to doubt their senses. Every rustle in the dark could be an ambush. Every farmer could be a spy. Fear, the very weapon they once wielded, now turned against them. They had entered a war they could not understand, a war where the enemy was nowhere and everywhere at once. By the time the Mongols realized they were fighting illusions, their confidence had already begun to crumble. The empire of horsemen, once masters of strategy, had met their match in a people who fought not with power, but with patience and intellect. The storm of conquest was beginning to slow, and the winds were changing direction. The Mongols believed the rivers of China would bow to their will just as the plains had. They were horsemen, conquerors of land, not masters of water. Yet, to control China, they had to cross its veins, the Yangtze, the Huai, the Yellow River, and that was where their empire of hooves would begin to falter. For centuries, the Chinese had learned to turn the rivers into weapons. They had done it before, in the legendary Battle of Red Cliffs 1,000 years earlier, when cunning minds had used wind, flame, and current to destroy an invincible fleet. Now, history was preparing to repeat itself, not as legend, but as vengeance. By the time the Mongols reached the Yangtze Delta, they were confident that their dominance on land could extend to the water. They conscripted shipbuilders from the conquered north and built fleets of massive barges, believing they could simply overwhelm the Chinese navy, as they had done with every enemy before. But Zhu Yuanzhang and his admirals were ready. The rivers, once the Mongols' obstacle, would become their grave. The Chinese constructed false docks and supply points along the riverbanks, tempting the Mongols to divide their forces. Scouts reported signs of weakness, thin patrols, half-manned defenses, and merchant ships loaded with grain. The Mongols, driven by greed and hunger, took the bait. Their fleets split into 3 divisions to strike quickly from multiple directions. What they didn't know was that every channel, every bend, had been carefully prepared for their arrival. When the first Mongol fleet entered the narrow section of the Yangtze, the air was unnaturally still. The fog hung heavy, muting sound and sight. Then came the first signal, a single horn echoing from the mist. In an instant, the river erupted into chaos. Chinese fireships, loaded with oil and gunpowder, surged forward with the current. The Mongols tried to maneuver, but the narrow waterway betrayed them. Their massive barges collided, unable to turn. The fire leapt from hull to hull, devouring sails and men alike. Within moments, the Yangtze itself seemed to burn. Those who tried to escape to the shore found no safety there. Hidden archers rained arrows from the cliffs, while concealed trebuchets hurled flaming projectiles into the water. The Mongols screamed curses at ghosts they could not see. For every man they killed, 10 more drowned, dragged under by the weight of armor or the whirlpooling currents. The river claimed them without mercy. Zhu Yuanzhang's generals stood watching from the high banks. They did not rejoice, they calculated. Each victory was a lesson, each defeat an adjustment. They knew the Mongols would regroup, as they always did. But now, the illusion of invincibility was shattered. The Mongols had been forced into a kind of warfare they neither understood nor controlled. Over the following weeks, skirmishes along the waterways turned into full-scale engagements. The Mongols tried to adapt, but their horsemen became useless in the flooded terrain. Their ships, designed for transport rather than combat, were clumsy and slow. The Chinese, meanwhile, thrived in this environment. Their smaller, faster junks darted in and out of the fog, attacking like hornets before disappearing again into the mist. The rivers became alive, a shifting, breathing weapon of the Chinese resistance. By the end of the campaign, the Mongol fleet was a ruin of charred wood and twisted metal. Thousands of warriors, once feared across continents, now floated lifeless in the current. The Yangtze had reclaimed its sovereignty. From his command tent, Zhu Yuanzhang looked upon the smoke curling over the horizon and said quietly, "The Mongols fight with rage. we fight with reason, and reason never tires. The echoes of Red Cliffs had returned, not as a myth, but as a message. The Chinese could outthink the most ruthless empire on earth. The river had chosen its side, and it was not the Mongols. The Mongols had tasted defeat before, rare, bitter, and unforgettable. But never had it come from those they deemed beneath them. To the descendants of Genghis Khan, the Chinese were artisans, scholars, and traders, people of ink and silk, not steel and fire. The idea that these same people had turned back the most feared army in the world was unthinkable. And yet, the rivers of China told a different story. After the disaster at the Yangtze, Mongol commanders convened under the banners of the great Khan's heirs. They refused to see the loss as a sign of weakness. They blamed the weather, the terrain, even betrayal. Pride blinded them to the truth. In their arrogance, they convinced themselves that one defeat meant nothing, that a show of sheer force could crush any resistance. So they prepared an even greater campaign, one that would, in their words, wipe China's memory from the earth. But pride is the beginning of every empire's fall. As the Mongols reorganized, their supply lines stretched thinner than ever. From the northern steppes to the southern rivers, their army now spanned a continent, too vast, too scattered, and too hungry. Their generals quarreled over resources and glory. Some favored direct assaults, others demanded cautious sieges. No one could agree, and their famed discipline began to unravel. Meanwhile, the Chinese watched, quietly, patiently. Zhu Yuanzhang and his advisors understood that their greatest weapon was not an army, but Mongol ego. Every maneuver, every false retreat, every rumor they spread fed that arrogance like kindling to a fire. Word reached the Mongol commanders that the Chinese were amassing their final reserves near Lake Poyang, a large but vulnerable stronghold, said to hold the remnants of the rebel fleet. It was bait, and the Mongols lunged for it. The Mongol army advanced south with thunderous confidence. Villages emptied before them. Rivers glistened with their reflection. To the Chinese, the invasion looked unstoppable. But in truth, the Mongols were walking into a carefully crafted illusion. Fields had been flooded, hills mined with hidden traps, and bridges deliberately weakened. Every road that seemed open was a dead end. Every plain that looked safe was a killing ground. When the Mongols reached Lake Poyang, they found the Chinese fleet waiting, smaller, lighter, but prepared. The Mongols attacked with overwhelming force, expecting the same easy slaughter that had conquered so many kingdoms before. Yet, as their ships pressed forward, the wind shifted. The Chinese set their sails ablaze, steering burning vessels directly into the Mongol front line. Flames spread like divine punishment, turning the lake into a sea of fire. Trapped between fire and water, the Mongols tried to retreat, but the wind, once their ally, now betrayed them. The blaze devoured their banners, their supply ships, even their morale. Arrows hissed through the smoke. The Chinese struck from the flanks, disappearing into the haze, reappearing only to strike again. For 3 days and nights, Lake Poyang burned, and the Mongol arrogance burned with it. When dawn finally broke, the once mighty fleet was nothing but charred wreckage. Thousands of Mongol corpses floated beside their capsized ships, a grim mirror of the Yangtze's revenge. From his command tent, Zhu Yuanzhang wrote a single line in his journal. The proud see the trap only after the door has closed. The Mongols had made their fatal mistake, believing that brute strength could conquer a civilization built on wisdom, patience, and endurance. Their overconfidence had not just led them into defeat, it had blinded them to the truth that China was no longer the hunted. The hunter had changed, and the Mongols were now its prey. Among all the figures who rose from the chaos of war, none captured the essence of Chinese strategy like General Wang Jian, a man of quiet demeanor and razor-sharp intellect. To his soldiers, he was not merely a commander, he was a scholar of war, one who believed that every battle should be won before the first arrow was ever loosed. Wang Jian's philosophy was simple. The enemy's strength is his blindness. He understood the Mongols better than they understood themselves. They were warriors bred for motion, for speed and shock. Deprive them of those, and they became as helpless as beasts caught in a cage. His campaigns were built not on confrontation, but on control, shaping the battlefield long before the enemy arrived. While Mongol generals rode at the front, Wang Jian studied from afar, observing the flow of rivers, the direction of winds, and the morale of villages. His maps were not drawn with borders, but with opportunities. Where others saw swamps and forests, he saw weapons. Where others saw delays, he saw traps. When the Mongols regrouped after Lake Poyang, seeking revenge, Wang Jian was waiting. He sent scouts to leak false information about weakened defenses in the south. The Mongols took the bait, dividing their forces into 3 columns. Each believed it was closing in on a scattered Chinese army. In truth, they were walking straight into a design of perfect geometry. At dawn, the trap was sprung. The central Mongol column advanced into what looked like open farmland, but beneath the soil lay hundreds of buried stakes, hidden under shallow mud. Horses screamed, collapsing mid-charge, while Chinese crossbowmen unleashed precise volleys from the tree line. When the Mongols turned to flank, the side columns met the same fate, ambushed by troops emerging from concealed tunnels. The battlefield erupted not in chaos, but in orchestration. Every Chinese move felt preordained, every Mongol reaction anticipated. By nightfall, the field was silent. Thousands of Mongol warriors lay slain, their banners trampled into the mire. Wang Jian stood upon a ridge, his armor unbloodied. He had not needed to draw his sword. His mind had already done the killing. His tactics spread like wildfire across the resistance. Commanders adopted his principles: misdirection, patience, terrain mastery. The Mongols, once the teachers of terror, now found themselves students of humiliation. Every campaign they launched met not brute opposition, but invisible resistance, ambushes, shortages, phantom armies that struck and vanished. Word reached the Mongol court that the ghost general had defeated 3 armies without a single open battle. They called him sorcerer, demon, scholar of deceit. But to his men, he was simply the embodiment of Chinese wisdom, proof that intellect could outlast even the most ruthless force on earth. As Wang Jian rode along the quiet riverbanks after his final victory, he looked upon the reflection of the moon and murmured, "The strongest empire falls not by sword, but by thought." The Mongols had thundered into China with fire and fury. They were now leaving it in silence, undone by a man who had mastered not only the art of war, but the art of waiting. The Mongol army, though battered and bruised, had learned to respect the resilience of the Chinese. They no longer believed in swift victories, but rather in the slow, unrelenting grind of conquest. They had abandoned the open fields, retreating to siege warfare, their engines of war rumbling forward once more. The city of Hangzhou, the heart of the southern Song, became the last fortress standing between the Mongols and their final victory. Surrounded by high walls and nestled along the banks of the Grand Canal, it was a strategic jewel. The Mongols, intent on closing the war with a crushing siege, believed that they could starve the city into submission. They surrounded Hangzhou with their great machines, catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers, preparing to lay waste to everything within. But they underestimated one thing. The Chinese had learned to fight with both fire and time. And in Hangzhou, the spirit of resistance burned brightly. Wang Jian, who had not been part of the great river battles, now commanded the defense of the city. With his usual calm, he began to transform Hangzhou into a fortress, not just of stone and wood, but of cunning. The Mongols were about to face a siege of a different kind, one that would stretch their resources, patience, and morale to the breaking point. The Mongols expected their usual tactics to prevail. Their massive siege weapons would break down the city walls, their archers would rain down arrows, and their war horses would trample anything in their path. But Wang Jian had anticipated every move. As the first trebuchets launched their fiery projectiles, the Chinese deployed their secret weapon, water. Hangzhou, being a city of canals, was susceptible to flooding. Wang Jian had engineers secretly divert the flow of the canal, flooding the Mongol camps that had been set up on the city's outskirts. The Mongols, unused to fighting in such conditions, were caught off guard. Their trebuchets were rendered useless, their supply lines turned to mud, and their morale began to crumble as their horses struggled in the flooded plains. As the Mongols regrouped, thinking they could bring in reinforcements from the nearby hills, Wang Jian struck again. Using hidden tunnels, his forces ambushed supply wagons, cutting off the food and reinforcements that the Mongols so desperately needed. And while the Mongols sent more troops to bolster their ranks, the Chinese continued their psychological warfare. Messages of false victories were sent back to Mongol camps, only to be followed by attacks that made them question the safety of their own rear lines. Every day the siege continued. The Mongols grew weaker, not from lack of soldiers, but from lack of hope. Their great siege engines, stuck in the mud, became symbolic of their failure. They had become immobile, like a snake caught in its own coils. The more they tried to break down the walls, the more they were broken themselves. On the 45th day of the siege, as the Mongols prepared for one final assault, a surprise occurred. A force of Chinese reinforcements, led by none other than Zhu Yuanzhang himself, broke through the Mongol lines. The siege was lifted in a single, decisive charge. The Mongols, exhausted and scattered, were forced to retreat. For the first time in history, a Mongol army had failed in a siege. Their walls had fallen not by strength, but by cunning. And the lesson was clear. Sometimes, the greatest weapon is not the sword, but the mind. The Chinese had turned the Mongols' own tactics against them, and in doing so, they had changed the course of the war forever. The retreat from Hangzhou marked the beginning of the end for the Mongol Empire's aspirations in China. For years, they had believed that they were destined to rule over the lands of the East. Yet now they faced a grim truth. Their once unmatched tactics had failed against an enemy they underestimated. The Chinese had not only resisted, but had turned their strength into their greatest weapon, strategy. As the Mongols limped back into their northern strongholds, they realized they were fighting an adversary unlike any they had ever encountered. The Mongols had been masters of conquest, of moving swiftly and with brutal efficiency. But the Chinese had shown them that conquest was not always about speed. It was about perseverance, intelligence, and knowing when to strike and when to wait. Zhu Yuanzhang, the leader who had once been a humble peasant, now stood as the symbol of the Chinese resistance. His tactical brilliance, combined with the strategic genius of generals like Wang Jian, had turned the tide of war. Where the Mongols had relied on raw power, the Chinese had used their minds. They had outwitted the great empire of the horsemen, not by force, but by wit. By the time the Mongols realized their failure, the damage had already been done. Internal strife had begun to tear at the heart of their empire. The massive distances between their various military fronts became unmanageable. Their war effort stretched their supply lines too thin, and morale began to crack. Desperation set in as the empire's resources dwindled. Mongol warriors, once loyal and fearless, began to question their leadership. One by one, the Mongols' allies, who had once feared their might, began to slip away. Kingdoms that had been under Mongol control either rebelled or brokered peace with the Chinese, seeing that the tide had turned. The dream of Mongol dominance across Asia began to fade, and with it, the power of the Khan. In the following years, the remnants of the Mongol army, battered and broken, slowly withdrew from China's borders. The Chinese, under the leadership of Zhu Yuanzhang, did not simply drive the Mongols out, they reclaimed their land with a vengeance. By 1279, the southern Song dynasty was officially restored, and the Mongol threat was vanquished. As the last Mongol forces retreated into the deserts, the Chinese had proven their point. The unstoppable force had been stopped, not by an equal amount of brute strength, but by the power of resilience, cunning, and strategic mastery. Zhu Yuanzhang would go on to found the Ming dynasty, ushering in an era of Chinese strength and stability. The Mongols, who had once seen themselves as the lords of the world, would now look back at China not as a subject, but as a lesson. The Chinese had outlasted them. Their walls, their rivers, their wisdom had been the final key to victory. For the Mongols, their empire would never truly recover from this defeat. History would remember them not as the conquerors of the East, but as the ones who were outsmarted by a people they had once deemed weak. The Chinese had not just reclaimed their land, they had shown the world that intelligence, patience, and determination could defeat even the most ruthless of invaders. And so, the legacy of the Mongols' downfall would forever be remembered, not as a story of war, but as a testament to the power of the mind in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Was this a victory of tactics, luck, or something else entirely? What do you think was the true turning point in the Mongol-Chinese conflict? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories of historical genius. Did you think the Mongols were unstoppable? Let us know how you would have faced this overwhelming force.